The following is a production of KYNE TV in cooperation with UNO Television. Consider This with Carol Schrader, a news and informational program recorded on the campus of the University of Nebraska at Omaha. Here is your host, Carol Schrader.
Hello and welcome to the Milo Bale Student Center at UNO. Once again, we have student elections going on this time. I guess a real tight runoff for student president regent. It's a big deal on the UNO campus. And consider this, we've got the day before Halloween, and the little ghosts and goblins are hoping and praying that the streets will get cleared up in Omaha and that the power will go on in their neighborhood so they can at least get some candy and maybe pull a little stunt or two. Also consider this, that All Hallows Eve is a favorite holiday or festival day for Satanists and people involved in satanic cults. Now, we've heard a little bit about them in the news. Are they around here? Are they real? My guests today are Denny Whalen, longtime private investigator in the Omaha area. And one of his specialties is cults and investigating cults, rescuing young people, even adults from cults, and getting them involved with some help or possible deprogramming. Dr. Todd Hendrickson is assistant professor of psychiatry with the UNMC Creighton psychiatric program. I want to welcome you both today. We were hoping to get someone with the religious community, but I think there's probably enough to talk about. I think it's probably easy to understand their stand on at least the Christian community. Denny, I'm going to talk to you first because you have culted for as long as I've been in news. You have been on the lookout for, investigated. Sometimes they even say Denny Whalen blows smoke. My experience isn't that at all, but do satanic cults exist? I mean, or is it just this, just a natural Wiccan kind of loving nature kind of thing?
There are many satanic cults, a lot of them in this area.
Well, we heard that over the years back. Was it? I want to say back in the Franklin credit investigation and all that, there was satanic cults talked about. There have been other cases, and most recently in the news, it was in Mississippi that the young man took the gun, shot his mother, his girlfriend, shot around school, and it was later revealed that there was some sort of satanic cult of boys that had a plan to murder a number of people over a 10-month period. And just last week I pulled a thing in Keokuk, Iowa, saying that a bunch of teenagers had been heavily involved in satanic worship. Now, it's just a play game, Dr. Henriksen, just kind of a fun thing, like the Dungeons and Dragons and that sort of thing.
Well, I think there's a fair amount of some groups, especially adolescents, and maybe pre-adolescents that play with those kind of issues. But I think from a clinical standpoint, what we tend to see are adolescents oftentimes who are significantly disturbed, usually come from very difficult home situations and tend to have difficulty kind of allying themselves with their peers. And this becomes one kind of specialized way for them to kind of be special and unique. And then usually it takes a very odd twist and turn where they get into activities that are clearly risk-taking and oftentimes dangerous.
Now, when we talk about satanic cults, are we talking about actually, I have a hard time just personally putting these words together, but worshiping Satan? Do they understand whether you believe in this sort of thing or not, do they understand what Satan is, or do they have a mindset they're actually aligning themselves with, I guess, the powers of evil, maybe is a way to represent it?
Well, the people that get in it are well educated as far as what the worshiping is and what the doctrine of it and the whole idea of what Satan is. And so they follow their peers or their leaders and become very, very involved in the violence and all of the other things that go along with Satanism, the drugs and the sex and the violence. I guess violence separates it more from the occult than any other thing. Is a level of violence and the extreme. And this all started in the 80s.
Started big in the 80s, but kids, you're talking about groups of kids maybe that just get together and think they're Satanists. You're referring to, an adult form of cult worship.
worship.
Or maybe you see teenagers at least hearing about that sort of thing or being actually involved.
I think some of the adolescents and even some of the young adults that we see in cults, as far as from a clinical perspective, there's some common scenarios. They, as a group dynamic, they tend to have a real fixed belief system. It's very rigid. The group itself has a very high cohesiveness, and so there's great resistance within this kind of ultra cohesive group for any members not to believe what the other members believe. And there's even more resistance to letting members leave or having kind of outside interests kind of pervade the group. So it's a real ultra cohesive group, which also then leads to the pathology, because there's more likelihood for group activities, especially violence, to be almost accepted by the group because they don't challenge themselves on what that belief is.
And many people might think that that this is a just cult-like behavior that kids can get in because kids look for something to identify with. But if you talk to a lot of Christian groups, or they don't have to be fundamentalists, but if you talk to those groups in particular, you find, downright, well, they complain to the news media all the time about Halloween and that we're going along with something. I mean, they take Satanism very seriously as a very proactive stance at evil and antithesis of good. And is that your experience in the groups that you've been familiar with?
The people we have investigated and become aware of, and none of them are spreading anything good.
Well, I mean, they're not nice people.
These people are violent. They're, like I say, they're heavily involved in activities, illegal activities, criminal activities. They are into heavy use of drugs. Most of them, when performing their acts of violence, especially murder, are carried to extremes where they mutilate the body and this type of thing. Again, this starts a lot in the 80s, and you have basically maybe one or two kids or one young adult, 17, 16, that kills somebody, usually a family member or a close friend, and the media built around that and called it satanic or Satanism in the 80s. That started the awareness, and finally the awareness grew to a point where more people became involved, more people joined, and started this type of behavior. And then you had the heavy metal coming in with the music and the satanic and the drugs and sex and all of that.
Probably lured some young people into at least looking at that as kind of a...
Well, and I think one of the aspects of this kind of group activity is that there's a seduction, and usually that's in the form of a number of different types of rituals. And the rituals may be of a violent nature, they may be of a musical nature, they may be rituals of chanting. I mean, there's a very patterned kind of a way to say that I belong to this group. And so there's a lot of variability in the type of rituals that these groups get into.
I guess maybe I have a hard time, even though, I believe that this all can happen around here, but in the years that I've been covering news, we've covered, and Denny will probably remember this, you'd find a cave and it's got pentagrams and inverted crosses and some of the so-called satanic cult symbols. But no one was ever really able to put something together. Maybe it's because law enforcement wasn't real open with us. Maybe it was people like Denny are, a little cautious about being real open. So people just say, not really here, couldn't happen here. They're playing at, growing up and being different. Bunch of kids going out in the cave, off to the farm field.
Well, you read the newspaper over the years about the mutilation of animals and different things around the area.
That started when I started in radio, the big thing, the farm animals.
And
so that's been going on a long time.
That's part of the whole thing, cutting up the certain parts of the animal to be able to use in rituals, in their sacrifices and what they call. And we investigated the disappearance and the ultimate murder of a boy by the name of Jay Durnell.
I remember that.
In our search along the river, out near Riverside Lakes, we found mutilated animals, bones, skins, the whole animal cut up, various other things, indicating that there was some activity along the river as to the satanic types of ritual using animals. That was one of the first things. And then we started getting through the mail letters that had Satanism, and their sayings and what they were saying to us was all satanic in connection to Jay Darnell's disappearance and murder.
It's what, 23 years ago, 24 years ago?
And we ran into the same thing in the Johnny Gosch case, and we worked on that for 7 months over in Des Moines, and we were contacted by the Iowa Department of Social Services out of Carroll, Iowa, and we were given a location and interviewed a young woman that had been in a satanic group through her family for years and years, and she was just almost a psychotic. And they led us to a wooded area. We found half-filled buckets of blood, which ended up being animal blood, but all of the signs and the things were there for some type of sacrifice or ritual, and this all ties into it.
Christians that are really concerned, in fact, I have an article here about in Israel, satanic cults there, and the Knesset was even listening to testimony from parents and concerned family members. Whether you buy that it is someone who actually worships evil, Satan, the devil, whatever you want to call it, or whether it's just kids involved or even adults involved in something because a counterculture kind of thing. And I think that there are many people that want to be counterculture. They feel alienated. I mean, it's not real hard sometimes in this society with so much information, so many hard choices, the specialization of jobs and lifestyles to feel that way. So maybe people are just saying, you know, it's normal. You're going to have a certain percentage of the population that just sort of gets into this odd stuff, like, and I'll probably have the Scientologists after me, but, you know, Scientology, the Sun Young Moon, this kinds of thing, finding that home. I mean, why do people go to Husker games? You know, they have something, that could be a cult. You know, you've got to have something to hang your hat on.
Well, I think the difference is between some of the more group activities where maybe there's more of an obsession with a group, let's say like
fanaticism.
Fanaticism I think is different than what you really see in the true cult kind of group, because there's really, the level of cohesiveness is really striking. And I mean, even to the point with the recent media portrayal of the group that thought they were going to be picked up by spaceships. I mean, if you look at
Heaven's Gate.
I mean, if you look at the Heaven's Gate members, I mean, they dressed alike. They had very similar haircuts. They ate the same meals. I mean, there's a regimented, ritualistic kind of approach to kind of depersonalizing it. It's in family therapy, for example, when we work with families who have been members of cults or are actively involved in cults, we talk about the difference between like the enmeshed family and the disengaged family. And the cult is really interesting because the individual members of the cult usually are asked and forced to disengage from their own family of origin, but also expected to be completely enmeshed in their new family. And that creates quite a paradox, but also at an age where, you know, especially adolescence, it's an extremely vulnerable time. And there is this issue of I must have my own identity. There is a counterculture kind of issue, and that's also part of the seduction.
But they get their own identity and then they become lost. They have no identity.
Right.
Well, they become brainwashed, and I think there's a systematic kind of programming, if you will, of isolation, intimidation, and alienation. And so they're isolated, they're intimidated often by the power member of the group, who usually everybody knows who that is. And that creates
and feel some personal kinship with almost
there's an
a father
identification,
figure.
or almost oftentimes the cult leader does have some serious psychiatric problems, like a
Jimmy
delusional
Jones.
disorder where they're very grandiose and religiously preoccupied beyond reality, and that's the charisma.
Waco,
Exactly.
Jim Jones.
Exactly.
You've got a lot
Some
of them.
messianic or maybe some
Well,
sort of...
there's a lot of difference between what you would call a cult, being Scientology or
Right,
Divine
I
Light
want to be real
Mission,
careful.
Right.
those types of groups, destructive groups, and then the occult, and then Satanism. There is a difference
what
between.
is the difference, and why is it so different that parents should be concerned about if their kids start doing things like, I guess, you know, liking to be naked or sleeping naked or suddenly, or or celebrating full moons or certain holidays besides Halloween. I mean, why is that different from just, well, they might have taken up a new religion or...
Well, if I had a child that went into the Unification Church or the Divine Light Mission and some of those groups, I would be aware and concerned, but I don't think I would be nearly as concerned if I found out he was involved into Satanism, because of the level of violence that's considered with Satanism. It's a much more intense, much more violent, much more criminal. There's so much more activity that is so much harmful to people, and not only to the individual, but to those around them. Whereas the occult gets into the tarot cards and palm reading and all those types of things, and the more paganish types of rituals, you know.
More naturalistic kinds of rituals.
Right. And so there's a big difference between the three. It's three different types of groups, and it's just like the hate groups is even another thing.
Well, I understand there's a lot of, in the violence, there's a lot of sexual, I guess a lot of people would say perversion, but sex is used in a very violent way oftentimes, and maybe that's where we see some real mental damage done.
Yeah.
And oftentimes that's used as a kind of power broker, you know, as a part of the group involvement, because it's a real powerful influence. It creates a powerful influence on behavior, sexuality and sexual behavior. It's deemed as powerful, especially amongst adolescents.
If evil and violence and whatever, you know, however you want to, and I feel real lame here, you know, because this gets into people's kind of personal psyche of that's religious and just morality and just who they are. So I'm picking and choosing my words carefully, and I'm probably messing it up. But if this evil or bad stuff or violence and the intensity of it is so damaging, and if it were around so much, wouldn't we see evidence of it a little more visibly in the community or in pockets?
I think you see a lot of evidence, but it's never identified as that. You know, you read a lot in the newspapers of, so this kid killed his mom and dad, or this person did this, or this, you know. There's a lot of murders that are convicted. They're not identified as being part of Satanism. They're not talked about.
But I'm not going to look at every time like that unfortunate situation in Omaha where the husband and wife, the son stabbed his mother to death, and it was identified that there was a dysfunctional problem with that family. I mean, the judge, I'm not trying to make this up, the judge clearly talked about it. Then you don't say, well, Satanism, cults, satanic cults, do you? I mean...
No, but if you go into the home and if you go into and do an investigation and do the processing of the investigation, you'll find out the activities of this individual and whether they are or not involved in Satanism or some form of the occult. It will be there. It will be there, and there's the information you find in the room, and the dress codes, the type of things he do, the people he runs with or hangs with, and most of them are very much isolated. Many of them are loners. And these crimes are not committed by groups of people. They're usually by one person.
I think from a clinical perspective of working with, you know, cult members, ex-cult members, families, we would look at a wide range of type of pathology you see in these families, and oftentimes there is it's part of our differential diagnosis. I think is what we would look at it.
What
as.
does that mean?
That means like the different things that could possibly explain this behavior, and so that may include satanic cult worship. That may include mental illness. That may include substance abuse. And in fact, there's some common threads as...
Could involve all three.
Exactly. And when you combine, substance abuse issues, family dysfunctions, at an age where there's lots of rebelliousness, and anyway, you always have the potential for things happening that and then there's a wide range, if it's, violent versus more, playful, experimentation. And that's what we try to figure out is kind of the level of dangerousness, because then you may have to make a decision clinically on, what do we offer for these young people.
What happens to the human mind, and you're the psychiatrist, but you've also seen it in people that you've pulled out of cults. You've at least seen some of the symptoms of it. What is it about the human mind when you get into I'm sure people think that a good deal of the young population, probably myself even, if you have any violence involved with your life, that the devil has a part in it, and that you know, the human race is going to the dogs and missing the message of Christ or whatever God, and you know, say, well, we're just going to the dogs and we're going to Satan. But specifically, what are the kinds of things that happen that are really, really awful that you just wouldn't see in kids that are rebellious? I mean, what would really worry a parent? To me, anyone that's watching this show, being on public television, I don't think they're like hanging out with cults. I mean, that's just a guess. But they might be parents with kids. I mean, what's the kind of thing that's, you know, danger?
Well, you see the players, the young people that are beginning to dab in it and play with it, is very obvious because they start doing things to their bodies. They start changing their hair, and they're wearing different things in black and all the other signs and symptoms. You go through their rooms and you find literature, you find the scrolls and the signs and the various other things. They start wearing things. So there's a lot of outwardness, and along with that there's this total rebellious, and the attitude is very negative and very destructive.
But how do we tell the difference? I mean, what kid hasn't gone out and shaved his head? I mean, not that all of them do, excuse me, parents. But I mean, if my son did that, I think I'd be really upset and I might be concerned. But is it more a system of things as opposed to?
Well, my view has always been that it's a pattern of behaviors, and it's not just any one incident. Although I would say that when we see kids and adults who self-mutilate, that is always a red flag for us. That, you know, that's clearly a pathological behavior, especially if it's done in a violent, sort of ritualistic sort of way. So we look at clusters of behaviors, patterns over time. But for me, when you start seeing the activity interfere with other things that they used to hold passionately, whether that's academic things, their peers change,
playing the piano,
their ideas, when other things that they've always derived pleasure from begin to change, and the ritual or the cult involvement becomes the centerpiece, and sometimes it's subtle. But that's when you really say, you know, there's an obsessional preoccupation here.
I would imagine that kids that are involved in just this negative kind of behavior, this pattern of negative behavior, that could lead to just too much dabbling or involvement in a real cult situation, that they hide a good deal. I mean, I'm sure there are certain banners to communicate to one another.
Right.
Inverted crosses, you know, just all kinds of things, but that I probably have no idea what they are. But on the other hand, they must want to keep certain things very kind of secret and to themselves. So a parent can, out of just good-hearted parent, can still be oblivious.
That's true.
So, I mean, so what, you know, they're going to fight. They might even call you names. I mean, kids go through these darn stages. They're teenagers like we were.
That's true, but I would also, you know, I'd point out that, you know, when it takes on that level of kind of intensity and preoccupation, there's usually slips. There's usually not the attention to detail, like what time am I coming home, looking at curfew issues, types of things I do, missing school, you know, drug and alcohol use, those kind of issues. And you're going to see those. Somebody's going to pick up on that. And that may be somebody in the school system, that may be a friend, that may be a neighbor, and maybe it will be family. That's been my experience.
Cases that you've been involved with.
And this whole thing escalates. This behavior escalates to a point where it's going to go, you hope to stop it before it goes over into some real violent activity.
I think violence is the biggest fear of any parent. Kids will go through things, well, maybe they'll get their ears pierced when you forbid it, or maybe they'll even pierce their navel, or, and you go, my God, they're mutilating themselves. Well, you say pattern. At what point do you say, I need to grab this kid by the collar and get them some help because the next day is over the edge, or the next month is over the edge? You know, the kids that you've pulled out.
Well,
I mean, we're all working and we're too busy and we're full of guilt on top of it. And, you know, I always figure I'm going to miss a sign.
The question is, when do you intervene?
Yeah. And intervene means really intervene.
Right.
you've lost all control. And
Like,
the child,
no
that
parent
child or
wants it
that
to
person,
get to that point.
well, the child or that person, you get to that point where they no longer go along with anything that comes from the family, from mother, from dad, from society, from school. They're just totally rebellious. They don't care. Nothing counts except what they believe in, and that belief is what has been instilled in them, either in the occult or through the satanic type of activities.
So it may not just be the other cheerleaders on the squad, you know, that you want to be with. I mean, teenagers go through that phase where they sort of abandon their family in a sense that the
Part of
peers
that's
are
normal,
more,
part of
right.
that's normal
Yeah.
But
development.
when the belief structure or becomes almost the obsession with not
It's
just
very fixed, very rigid, and outside activities become less and less important. And usually that's dealing with family issues.
by intervention, when you intervene, what does that mean? Does that mean, you know, you got a kid that's 18 or 16, 17, 18 years old, weighs 20 pounds more than you do, stronger. How do you pull off an intervention?
Well, I mean, my experience actually is working more
Or
with
maybe
adult.
13, 14.
My experience clinically has been more with adult cults.
Okay, if you have
will.
a brother, a sister, a son, a daughter that is
Well, if
22,
there's-
23.
For us, you know, if we're going to do what you're offering is you're gonna try to get that individual hooked up with a person who they probably trust, if you can. But a lot of times that's not possible, and so oftentimes we end up doing an involuntary treatment of some sort, and usually that requires a board of mental health commitment, mental health hearing, and it's harsh, but if you have evidence of mental illness and evidence of dangerousness to self or others, then those are the two criteria that are met for pursuing a commitment. Now, if it's working with a minor, parents actually have a lot more ability to do involuntary treatments. For adults, it's different.
Should we, Denny, should we be scared of this? I mean, not every day sitting there wringing our hands, but is this something to be afraid of?
Absolutely. You bet.
And it is around us, maybe not next door or down the street.
I had a man call me the other day. He says he and his fiancée are looking at a house to buy. So they had the realtor take them through the place. They got down to the basement, and here's an altar. What the hell's an altar doing in this basement of this house? And the house right now is divided into 3 apartment units. We started looking into it. There's 2 guys living in that particular location that are into Satanism, and they're doing all kinds of stuff in that basement. And they have another little room that's locked. You can't get in. Even the owner doesn't have a key, and these people won't let you in. So you have to break down the door if you really want to see what's in that place.
But this is
But
in
there's a
Omaha.
lot of things happening in that house, in that basement, and people coming to that location. Now this guy says, is it safe for us to even buy it? I said, well, you move them all out, and they probably won't come back unless they got a skeleton in the basement that they want to dig up and not.
Well, the
whatever.
point is, we've run out of time. Tomorrow is Halloween. There are plenty of things to be afraid of, and they don't wear little masks bought at a dime store. I want to thank you for being with us.
Thank you.
I'm sure the Med Center in Creighton would be a resource if they needed
Sure.
him. Certainly Denny would. Todd Hedrickson, Denny Whalen, thank you for joining us.
Thank you.
As always, consider this.